Okay, let's look at these camera options. Now, there are a lot of properties in this list, but the majority of them are all focused on one thing, so don't get too overwhelmed. Let's just walk through them together. First of all, we have the zoom, and this is literally going to just change the zoom of your lens, just like we were in the camera settings with choosing the focal length preset or the millimeter measurement of our lens. This is what's determining how far zoomed in or out our lens is. So we can go really far wide or we can go really far in. Because we're doing this digitally on a computer and it's all just math and pixels, we aren't limited to any real world focal length. So you can really stylize this if you want and make it as far out and wide and distorted as you want, or make it nice and zoomed in. It's totally up to you. If I were to select this camera layer and go into the camera settings, I can always change this back to one of the presets, so let's say 24 millimeters. Now all these other millimeter measurements, they're all there just to kind of give you an idea of how After Effects is calculating what it's seeing. And you can see that we even have this nice diagram of an actual film camera. But there are lots and lots of properties here that apply to real world measurements. But honestly, the way that we work as motion designers, most of the time, you just want to get it to look the way you want it to look. So you don't have to worry too much about what this looks like. I'm never adjusting these properties within the camera settings dialog. So don't worry about that. I'll just change the preset back to 24 millimeters and click OK. But if you ever wanted to animate the zoom of your lens, you can absolutely do it that way, setting a keyframe for the zoom. Next is depth of field, and this is basically what's going to enable all of the remaining properties to even be applicable. So depth of field, if you're not aware, is a photography term for how much of your scene will be in focus when you're taking a picture or video. If you have a lot of depth of field, then most of your scene is going to be completely in focus and not blurry at all. A shallow depth of field is going to give you very blurred out backgrounds and foregrounds, and whatever your subject is, whatever's in focus, will be nice and sharp. So let's take a look at what that does right now. If I enable the depth of field, nothing really changes, and that's because the settings that we have for controlling that depth of field are pretty low right now. So it's not very noticeable or apparent that depth of field is enabled. To make this a little easier to see, I'm going to switch back to my two views horizontal, and I'm going to move my suns around so that there's some that are closer to the camera and some that are further away. Okay, so already we can see that things are getting a little bit blurry. Let's switch back to our one view mode. And you can see that this is slightly blurrier than this one, and this one is slightly blurrier than this one. The next property is the focus distance, and this is going to determine what's in focus at any point in time. And the distance is basically how far away from the camera the focus will be set. But to see this even more dramatically, we need to go to the next property, which is aperture. This is another photography term. An aperture of a lens is actually what determines how much light is let in through it, and the wider the aperture, the more light is let in. But a side effect of that is that you have a shallower depth of field. Less of your image will be in focus the more light you let in. Again, if you're not following along, that's okay. The important thing to note is that if we increase the aperture, you can see that right away things get blurrier. This sun that's a lot closer to the lens is much blurrier. Our grid is blurry up here. It's in focus right here, and it gets blurry towards the back. Now that we can see that blur a lot more clearly, I'm actually going to switch to just fitting this to 100% so we can see nice and clear. This is where everything is in focus. I can now change my focus distance. If I dial it back, I can kind of target this point of my scene so that this sun is in focus. And if I back it up even further, we can get it to the point where this sun in the foreground is in focus. Now this is really close to the camera and it was a low resolution comp, so that's why we're still getting some pixelated edges here, but it is in fact in focus. So if I were to go to the start of my timeline, set a keyframe on the focus distance, and then go forward maybe 2 seconds, move my work area by pressing N, and then shift this focus distance back to, say, the second sun, right about there. And maybe I'll bring these in a little bit and just ease them by pressing F9 on the keyboard. We can now animate this focus distance changing. And you can see really clearly, because we have this grid on the floor, what exactly is happening. We're adjusting the focus of our camera lens to go from the foreground sun to that midground sun. And to make it even easier to know whether or not what we want in focus is actually in focus, just switch over to your 2-up view, and you can see this new line on our camera display, and this is indicating where our focus actually is set. So I can be very precise this way, zoom in nice and close here, and make sure that this is 100% just locked in to that first sun right there that's closest to the camera. Then go to the second keyframe, shift around here, holding down spacebar to temporarily switch to my pan tool, and then just modify that focus distance until it's nice and lined up with that back sun. Alright, and now I know for certain that this sun in the background is in focus at this point, this sun right here is in focus at that point. So that's just a really useful overlay of our camera dialog in this top-down view, or any view where you can actually see the camera. Okay, I'm going to switch back to my one view. Cool, so the next option is our blur level, and you can basically think of this like a multiplier of the aperture. So at 100%, it's going to behave the way that you would think it would, but if you want it to have even more blur, you could say pump that up to 150, and everything's going to be a lot more blurry. Or you could drop it down by 50%. This is also a way to easily enable or disable depth of field if you were ever trying to animate that on or off. Instead of animating the focus distance, I could just set the blur level, go forward, and turn it all the way down to 0. And then that's going to animate from lots of depth of field to absolutely none. Okay, the next property is the iris shape. And you can actually see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties in a row are all related to the iris. And then we have 3 related to the highlight. So what exactly is the iris? Well, the iris is another photography term. This is a real world thing where the shape of the aperture of the lens, which is made up of a bunch of blades, can actually shape the way that the out of focus objects look. So to see this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to make another circle, and we don't need a gradient. Let's just make it kind of a bright color. I'll change it to a solid, and let's just say a nice bright pale green. Okay, and I'm going to make it a perfect circle. We'll say 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Make sure it's 3D. And I want to place this pretty far in the back. So let's switch to our top-down view and move it back towards the sun, but also over to the side, just so we can distinguish between the two. I'll switch back to my active camera, and there it is, really out of focus, but we can tell that it's there. If I turn the depth of field off and back on, you can see what's happening. I'm actually going to disable the visibility of this sun, just so we can see that a little bit more isolated. And what you'll notice is that even though that was a circle, when it's blurred out of focus, it's kind of a rectangle now. It's a square, basically. And that's because of our iris shape. It's set to fast rectangle. And if we look at all the other options, they're basically just polygons with another side added. So if I change this to triangle, the out of focus shape looks like a triangle. If I move it up to a square, it's going to be boxy. Every one of these is going to up the number of sides on that polygon, which will make this out of focus shape more and more realistic to what actually happens in the real world with actual lenses. But the side effect is that it takes longer to render the more sides that you add. It's kind of like samples of motion blur. Now if I move it all the way up to decagon, this is probably going to be the most realistic. It'll just take longer to render. I'm going to turn the aperture level down so it's not quite so dramatic, but something like that should be fine. And then I'll just duplicate this shape. I'll rename it actually first to circle, duplicate, and then move it over. Grab that handle and move it over here. And I want to change this shape to being a square. So I'm going to disable my depth of field for a second, add in a rectangle. I'll move that into the ellipse group and just delete the ellipse. So now I have a square next to a circle, and I'll rename that square. And then I'm actually going to scale both of these down quite a bit, just so they're really tiny. Okay, so we've got a tiny circle, a tiny square. And then I'll turn the depth of field back on. And now we can see these really faint out of focus blobs here. I'm going to zoom in nice and close so we can see that at this scale, a circle and a square are basically going to blur out to the same shape. And if I turn this back down to say an octagon instead of a decagon, you can start to see those angled edges a little more clearly. And I realize this is probably a little difficult to see, so I'm going to use my little adjust exposure control down here just to artificially boost the brightness of my comp so you can see this a little easier. So those little angles here are what I'm talking about. If I change this down to pentagon, then we're just going to get the 5 sides, right? And the next value of iris rotation, that's going to just change the orientation of those out of focus objects. And that can make a pretty big effect on something like these grid lines. If I rotate the iris a little bit, you can see that it's really changing the way that those things are getting blurred out. But if we have more iris shape sides and we turn it up to decagon, it becomes much more round and you're not really going to notice. Now, that may or may not be something you want, so maybe you want to turn it down to octagon or heptagon to get that more straight edge look. It's totally an art-directed choice. It's something that you can choose, but that is how you modify the look of your out-of-focus objects. This is also referred to as bokeh, B-O-K-E-H. If you look that term up, you're going to see lots and lots of photos that have really shallow depth of field. The next option is iris roundness, and this can actually just smooth out all of those edges. So if you are going after that really round bokeh look, you can really speed this render time up by lowering the number of sides down and then just turning the roundness all the way up. You can even go all the way down to triangle and it's still pretty much circular on both the circle and the square shapes. But I'll leave this maybe at pentagon just to make that a little bit more perfectly round. And we can move on down to the next option, which is iris aspect ratio. Now this is something that if you start paying attention to the out of focus objects in things like movies, especially really cinematic movies, you'll notice that the out of focus objects are not perfect circles. They're actually a different aspect ratio because the filmmakers were using anamorphic lenses that have lots of distortion to them or something like that. So if I hold down Command or Control on a PC and click and drag to adjust this very slightly, we can control the aspect ratio of our iris and make it nice and tall and skinny like that, which is something you see pretty often in cinematic movies. So if I lowered it to maybe 0.6, we get ovals instead of circles. Or if I bump it up to 2.35, we're going to get really super wide out of focus ovals. But again, if you start paying attention, you'll notice that most of the time things like television are going to have perfectly round out-of-focus objects, and more cinematic movies are going to be filmed with anamorphic lenses, and they're going to have bokeh that looks more like this. The next option is the iris diffraction fringe. And I'm going to have to just be 100% honest with you. This is one of the very first times that I've ever come across something in After Effects that I cannot figure out what the heck it does. If I'm ever stumped by something, if I don't understand it, I always just go to the After Effects help online, and there's always an explanation of what something in After Effects does. I could not find a single article or external YouTube tutorial, anything explaining what this iris diffraction fringe does, and I couldn't actually get it to change anything inside of After Effects, no matter what I did. So if you know what it is, please leave a comment on the community tab so that I can learn what it does. But at this point, because I've never actually used it and I can't find anyone who explains what this is actually going to do, I'd say that you can just kind of ignore this property. And I'm just going to have to admit that I do not know everything, which is nothing new to me. I try to explain every feature that I possibly can in these types of classes, and unfortunately I could not figure out what this property does. So we're just going to scoot right on by this and move on to the next 3 options, which are the highlight gain, highlight threshold, and highlight saturation. So highlight gain, if I turn this up a little bit, and actually I'll turn my exposure control back down off. If I bump this up, we're not really seeing anything change. But if I turn my highlight threshold down, as I do that, you can see that different parts of my image are getting a little bit blown out. Right, let me turn this all the way back up and then just slowly bump it down again. If there was no highlight gain, then that brightness would not be happening. But what it's doing is taking the out of focus objects and things that are bright within those out of focus objects based on this threshold and making them brighter. We can also increase the saturation. So if we don't want this to look super pale and white, we can turn the saturation back up. And these 3 properties aren't really linked to anything else. If I change the focus distance, it's not going to change the highlight gain. This is really just a control for how brighter things in your scene are appearing overall. It doesn't really have anything to do with the camera itself, but this is where the controls for it live. Okay, so I'm going to turn that highlight gain all the way back off, and that is the end of the camera options properties. So those are all the things that we have access to currently with the camera, and now you can kind of see what all of those things are allowing us to do in shaping the way that our scene appears. It really adds a nice quality to the look of your scene by adding in these real-world properties that you would have with actual camera lenses. And it just looks cool. So it's really fun to play around with. But a really great benefit of being able to control this depth of field is that you're able to direct the attention of the viewer to a specific part of the scene. So if I turn that sun back on in the background, just by changing the focus distance of my camera, I can tell the viewer that they should be looking at this sun that's right up close to the camera by putting the focus distance right there. Or I could tell them, actually, you should be looking all the way in the background to that sun back here, and you can animate between those two. And if we add in a little bit of camera movement by using the track X and Y tool, we get this really nice sense of depth because we have the parallax effect between all three of these layers and the grid on the floor. We get that nice visual indication of depth. It's a sense of scale and distance that's a lot harder to fake in 2D. So even though we're working with 2D layers, because we have access to 3D space, we're able to add a greater sense of depth much more easily just by spacing things out in that 3D space.